maybe another, yes.
So, yes, thank you. Brigitte Ollier from UITP, the International Association for Public Transport. I just have a question on pricing. I think it's also a very important element of the white paper. Pricing, in fact, through prices, you can give also the right message to the right incentive, in fact, to the user, end user. But looking at pricing means also that transport will become more expensive, and I think here the question is mainly also to Mrs. Meissner. How does the Parliament, how do you feel, what would be still acceptable? Because I suppose it's a very important question for policymakers. How expensive can transport be? Because I think this will be a consequence also of all these measures.
Thank you. I think that's all we have time for. Let me turn to Keir to give some replies to some of those questions and comments briefly.
Right. Is it too much of a scattergun approach? How are we getting there? I mean, I think I actually agree rather with Werner Lubring on some of this. I mean, clearly this is a starting point for discussion. The Commission cannot deliver all of this on its own. We need to work with the member states to bring them into a picture. We need to work with industry, with all of you. We need to work with the general public. So, I mean, this is a beginning of a process. That's why we have to put some very stark choices in the paper, essentially, to show where we think we need to go. Because actually also, only if we make the vision very stark will people start to discuss it. But I think if you look at how we envisage getting to the modal shift target for freight, I think there is a lot in the paper that helps us in that direction. For a start, and given the difficulties we have even on the first rail recast, we're going to have to do a lot of work with the member states to persuade them of this. But there is the whole issue of making the railways more responsive to customer demand, particularly for long distance freight, which is something which, if you look at other parts of the world, particularly the United States, works extremely well. So there's no inherent reason the railways cannot deliver it. But in Europe, as the Vice President says very often, we're still faced with a system of railways which, for perfectly understandable historic reasons, are still very fragmented along the lines of individual member states. So the first thing we need to do is to actually work to remove those boundaries between the national railways and actually allow international, both passenger but particularly freight flows, to work much more efficiently, to be much more responsive to their customers. So when the logistics people, when the likes of DHL and UPS come and say, well, we'd like to run a train and we'd like to run it sort of tomorrow or next week, the answer they get is, well, yes, this is what we can do and this is how much it will cost. Not, well, we don't know about that, and sort of come back in 6 weeks' time and we might be able to tell you that it's possible that we'll only tell you the price afterwards, which, I mean, that may be a bit of an exaggeration, but that is what I hear from many of the people who say they would like to be the railways customers, is the reaction. It's not going to happen if that's the reaction. So clearly the first thing we need to do is address that commercial reality. But then the second way of making it happen is to make the railways actually have a perspective to have the investment. Now, people worry about the money, and they rightly worry about money because we're talking about huge sums. But equally, if we look at history, if we look at the development of the railways in the 19th century, if we look at the development of motorway systems in the 20th century, if we look at the development of airport structures in the 20th century, these things actually happened, the money was found, and in each individual state, probably the main infrastructure networks were created within a period of 30 or 40 years. Now, we face problems in the future, but I don't think we face any reason in the future why, if it really becomes clear to everybody, if everybody believes fundamentally that we need to transform our transport network, that we cannot do the same in the early 21st century as we did in the mid-20th century to build the motorways, the autoroutes, the autobahns, or as we did in the 19th century to build the railways. So, again, this is about vision. It's not just about the Commission regulating, making laws. We're good at doing that, but it doesn't always solve the problem. What we're trying to do here is give the political vision and the leadership which brings everybody in and solves the problems together. The question on hydrogen. I think there is a fundamental difficulty we face. On the one hand, the Commission is trying to be technologically neutral, We're trying to say that yes, there's hydrogen, yes, there's battery, yes, there's biofuels. All of them have promise, all of them have potential. And we don't want to commit today to policies which rely on one of them to the exclusion of the other. But at the same time, we also have a problem that to make any of these things work, we need to develop a charging infrastructure or a fueling infrastructure. And if we don't send relatively clear signals fairly soon, either that won't happen and we'll be faced with a perennial chicken and egg problem, or perhaps even worse, it will happen, but it will happen in different ways in different member states. So France, for example, which has been investing very heavily in electric vehicles, you'll drive your electric car around quite happily until you get to the border, sort of just after Strasbourg, and then Germany, where German car manufacturers would probably prefer biofuels. Well, plenty of biofuels in Germany, but no electric charging points. And we end up with a system where instead of being able to travel freely around Europe, we actually have very nationally compartmentalised markets. So what we've tried to do in the white paper is to acknowledge that that issue exists, not to make those choices between technologies today, but to set, by setting particularly the 2030 target, a very clear vision that actually we do need to be getting somewhere pretty fast, and to use that hopefully to signal to the investors and to the industry that they need to get on and they need to develop things. And then in 5-10 years' time, it will be more apparent which technology is going to win or which niche each technology is most appropriate for. And at that point, we make the standards and we hopefully build the pan-European networks.
Thank you. And if I could turn to Gesine Meissner to take this point directly about public acceptance of charging for transport.
Yes, of course I could do that. First, just to come briefly back to this gentleman in the middle who asked for how could we have money for the road infrastructure. Well, of course, I think it was said a lot about pricing in general and charging for infrastructure and the white paper. And I just mentioned right now we are fighting for earmarking in Eurovignette. It's something it could be reasonable. We need money for all the modes of transport, and it must be possible to finish a core network and to finish the infrastructure for all modes of transport. And coming back for the lady in the first row, you addressed me personally and you asked how expensive can transport be? Well, I could answer it must be affordable because transport, as I said in my first statement, transport is the backbone of internal market, and I talked about especially small and medium enterprises and all the other stakeholders who are involved in transport business, and we always have to take in mind, on the one hand, of course, how can transport be much more sustainable, how can we reach our goals, but on the same side, we have to ask ourselves, is it practicable? For example, does the transport still roll, flow, fly, whatever? Because we need all modes, and that makes it so different. That does make it so difficult because we have to think about everything.
It's a very wide-ranging point, and it sums up how wide-ranging this debate is. And I'm going to turn to Mark Gainsborough now. He's been sitting at the end of the panel and has been absorbing the debate we've been having, and he's going to sum up for us and to offer some conclusions. Over to you.
So for those of you that follow the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I was tempted to say that the answer is 42. So if you're expecting me to sum up with how we're going to solve this complex challenge, I'm not going to be able to do that for you. I just would like to turn to the audience a bit. So, based on what you've heard this evening, a panel of very expert folk, of the challenge that we have 70% decarbonisation in transport by 2050. Who, put your hand up if you feel really confident you've heard enough to think we're going to get there. So we have a lot of pessimists in the audience today, and I think one of the things that is a real challenge in this space is to combine the sort of long-term vision that the white paper is trying to set out with what are the short-term actions that will get us on the pathway. And I completely agree with other panelists who have said, we have to be taking some actions now and look at the things we can do now that get us on the right track. The philosophy that I have, and certainly the philosophy of my colleagues in Shell, is that this is an area where there is no silver bullet. And I think almost all the panelists recognize that basically we have to start doing almost all the things that we've talked about over the course of the coming years if we're ever going to get to 70% decarbonisation in transportation. If you look at the things that are available to us right now, clearly the things that make the most difference short term, vehicle efficiency is very important, and I think Europe in many ways has been leading the world in that, and we probably need to continue to make an important lead there. Also in terms of the fuel mix, clearly bringing biofuels in line with the obligations to fulfill the Renewable Energy Directive, that's going to be an important short-term issue. But in the end, those things need to be supplemented by the development of alternative drivetrains and alternative fuels. We need to work out what the role is going to be of hydrogen, which could be very important, but has huge first mover disadvantage, so it needs a big help to get going in the first place. We need to work out exactly what the role is going to be of battery electric vehicles in the mix. I mean, clearly there are some areas where it works, but there are tremendous challenges, I think, around consumer acceptance there. We also need to, as much as possible, steer away from the sort of hype and fashion and try and base it on facts. So I think that where we've got multi-party initiatives that bring together the EC, automakers, fuel suppliers, so that we get really fact-based analysis, we understand what the real performance is of the different pathways on a well-to-wheels basis for CO2, I think that's absolutely vital. I think there's been some great work done in that space in the last few years, but there is a lot more to do. There is no doubt it's not only about technology. We need to look really at the sort of modal mix that we have. For the modal shifts to take place, you've got to have the right incentives for people to change their behavior. I think if one of the criticisms that probably was valid around the white paper is maybe not explicit enough around the challenges of consumer acceptance and public acceptance. And I really would urge all of you working in the policy space to think hard about that. I mean, clearly, in the commercial world, we think a lot about what it takes for our products and services to be bought by consumers, and that is something that, at the end of the day, is absolutely crucial. So avoiding a bit of the fashion and the hype, getting down to the facts, recognizing there is no a silver bullet here, and really it's going to take a lot of collective action by both policymakers and indeed those of us that have to put products and services into the real world to make a material difference in this space. I think certainly from a Shell point of view, we absolutely see it as vital to make progress here. I mean, there are some constituencies that say, well, why bother with transport? It's all very hard taking CO2 out of transport. Let's just worry about power and stationary sources. The Shell perspective is that we do have to make steps in transportation as well. Transport has to play its part in decarbonisation, and in many ways Europe has to provide some leadership for what at the end of the day is a global challenge. And frankly, it doesn't matter how much progress we make in Europe, if we don't provide leadership to other parts of the world, it will not make the difference that we actually need to make. So I think rather than go on any longer, I don't want to put a barrier between you and drinks outside. I'd like to say thank you very much to everybody for coming along. Clearly a very engaged audience. Thank you to the panelists as well, and Jennifer for moderating. My one final word is, could you please fill in your evaluation forms, which have been handed out? That's one of your duties as the audience. And perhaps join me in thanking my fellow panelists. Thanks very much.
Thank you for being late for so late for dinner.